Hey, what's going on, you guys? My name is The Raptor, and after long last, we're getting back to reviewing your Death Battle matchup ideas. As usual, these fights are taken from the Who Would Win polls on my community tab. You can read this video's description for more details, but Tier 2 and 3 channel members can also submit their matchups directly to me in the Discord server. These ideas will be discussed over Ballot Banter live streams every other month, so click the join button below if you like the sound of that and all the other perks. But for now, let's take a look at what you all upvoted. First up on the list, Vox vs Mr. Puzzles, Hazbin Hotel vs SMG4. I saw this matchup get talked about a lot more after it was revealed that SMG4 was ending, and even though I've said before that having YouTubers on Death Battle doesn't really appeal to me as a concept, this is obviously different. Like, having characters from internet shows is still more than fine with me, as long as those series are still versus viable and all that jazz. And based on everything that I've seen up to this point, I can say that this is one of the best SMG4 matchups that I've come across, and among one of the better ones from Hazbin Hotel and that wider universe. I think the main thing that we can all agree on when talking about this matchup is that this whole episode would just be crazy fun to watch. The atmosphere could be amazing, and so could the presentation. That's kind of everything that these characters are. The way that they just show this fight unfolding could be so unique compared to all the other episodes. It has a really good core theme that uses the similarities and differences of their personalities really well and what makes them tick, and I think it can make for a really deep script, or at least a relatively deep script from what Death Battle is known for, talking about how people can shape public perception and how that public perception can shape those people in return. But despite the oodles of personality that this matchup undeniably has, it also unfortunately has practically zero debatability in a very similar fashion to Alistair versus Black Hat. We're actually going to be going over a number of matchups in this video where you could very easily argue that they are not debatable, but in different ways and to varying degrees. As far as this matchup goes, I think it's probably a little better than Alistair versus Black Hat, because there seems to be slightly more talking points, and it's hard to imagine finding characters for either of these guys that are more fitting for them than each other. But even still, I see these two matchups as very comparable. I don't think it's entirely fair to hate on Alistair versus Black Hat, but to turn around and completely love this idea. I just see them as too similar in what they do well and what they maybe do not so well. As far as likelihood, I do think Hazbin Hotel and or Hell of a Boss will be used at some point on the show. I just think it's gotten too popular. And even though SMG4 doesn't strike me as something Death Battle would want to give an episode, it is hard to imagine giving Vox a different opponent, like I said before, and something is only unlikely to show up on Death Battle until it shows up on Death Battle, so I don't know. We'll just have to see what happens. Next up, Tifa Lockhart versus Makoto Nijima, Final Fantasy versus Persona. I have wanted to get a new Tifa episode for quite a while now, for obvious reasons, but it wasn't until semi-recently that I actually landed on a definitively preferred opponent for her. I don't think Makoto is necessarily her most obvious pick to like the average person on the internet, but it still feels like the most well-rounded opponent out of what I know so far. And at very least, the games they come from have some similar aesthetics to each other and a big character focus, so the matchup still feels quite appropriate for them from that perspective alone. This could really be as flashy of a fight as Death Battle wants it to be, with a surprisingly big scope attached to it, just working in the escalation really well. I think it would require a more complicated script than normal though, because I think Death Battle would really have to go into those higher power levels, or more exact power levels I guess I should say, to really answer who would win and analyze things properly, but that just means it would lead to good representation. I've always said that one of Death Battle's major goals should be to analyze the characters as accurately as possible, so I don't see things getting more complicated as a bad thing. Both of these characters have a decently wide array of interesting abilities that can play off of each other really well in the animation choreography at least. It's probably not too debatable if you know a lot about how these series are scaled and these characters specifically, but I still think it would be hype enough for the normal crowd about, especially seeing how Death Battle now analyzes Final Fantasy and Persona from the more recent episodes. So I think a lot of people would still be excited for this. A lot of people wouldn't automatically know who wins, quote unquote. And if you're trying to say this one shouldn't happen because of its debatability, then you're basically removing tons of Persona or SMT matchups from contention as well. And I don't know how entirely fair that is, to be honest. And I think this episode is decently likely to happen. I don't know if Death Battle would put Makoto against anyone else, but I could see them giving Tifa a second episode, unless they're adamant about moving away from Final Fantasy VII. I would like to see other Final Fantasy games pop up on the show, but I also really want to see Tifa come back. That's just me. And this is honestly just her matchup now. It may not stay that way forever, but at least for this point in time, I have no problem claiming that. Moving on, Frankie versus Funky Kong, One Piece versus Donkey Kong. I did not know about this matchup at all until it was covered on Death Battle Cast, but since then it seems to have gotten a little bit of traction, which is really cool. I think this matchup is fun to think about, and it's a really easy match for both of them. I'm personally not dying for it. I don't want it as much as some other people do, but I don't think I could turn it down either. I think it's really cool when Death Battle puts a spotlight on sillier characters that are not as well known for their power levels, at least not compared to the protagonists of their series. And regardless of how powerful they actually are, I think the animation would be less about the spectacle and more about iconic, funny moments and interactions between the characters, because I think that's what a lot of people would be clicking on the video to see. And I would also imagine shorter analyses, still thorough enough to go over everything they need to go over, of course, but ultimately not wasting any time. However, as I'm sure a lot of you guys already know, this is one of those matchups that is not very debatable no matter what you use for Funky Kong, whether you're sticking to the Donkey Kong stuff or going into the general Mario scaling. It's pretty cut and dry either way. It's actually difficult for me not to compare it to King K. Rool versus Blackbeard in that way, because even though I know that matchup has fallen out of favor for a lot of people lately, I think there's at least a little more ambiguity when it comes to the debatability, which I think is better to have than to not have it. But still, the personality of this matchup is definitely very different and would be a lot of fun. And I think it could surprise some people for how strong these characters would realistically have to be. So it's not the worst example in the world, but no one is looking forward to this matchup for the debatability. It's really as simple as that. And I'm also kind of unsure about whether or not it's going to happen. Like I said, it definitely works really well as one of their silly episodes, but I feel like other characters from these franchises are more in demand for them to use quicker. But based on the Death Battle Cast episode, it seems like they would have fun doing it, so it's really up to them. If they want to make the executive decision to prioritize these characters, then they can definitely do that. After that, Gon Freaks versus Izuku Midoriya, Hunter x Hunter versus My Hero Academia. This feels like one of the earlier major matchups for both of these characters, and oh man, has it been liked and disliked by so many people throughout the entirety of its lifespan. I personally used to be fairly indifferent on this idea. I thought it could have been cool, but I really didn't care about it that much. But now in 2026, after so much time has passed, I can say that in my opinion, the quality of this matchup has kind of just depreciated as time has gone by. For one thing, I don't think Deku needs to be brought back to Death Battle in a really long time. We gave him a really good episode last year, My Hero Academia ended recently, we're getting Bakugo versus Reze next somehow. I think we can leave this kid alone for the time being. And it also doesn't help that he kind of has a troubling matchup spread. As far as most of his matchups go, they either pair him with an unpopular opponent, they don't have a lot of sauce, or Deku kind of got too strong for it to make sense anymore, which we saw a little bit actually with Spider-Man vs. Deku. Now, Hunter x Hunter obviously doesn't have any sort of popularity problem, but this matchup does unfortunately suffer pretty prevalently from the other two issues. The connections are there, but I think a lot of people can agree that most of them are pretty basic and definitely not very nuanced. In my opinion, Death Battle already went with Deku's best options. Yes, I'm including both Miles and Asta. I think they're just more interesting in a lot of ways. And the debatability, or some semblance of debatability, was there at some point, but it absolutely is not there anymore. The debatability is no longer on par with the level of popularity that this matchup has managed to somewhat hold on to. I'm not trying to say that this matchup is horrible. That's not what I'm saying at all. I don't really think we need it anymore, at least not as far as it becoming an actual death battle episode. And honestly, I wouldn't really bet on it happening anymore for very similar reasons to what I stated. I could really only see it if Death Battle really wanted to bring Gon on, and I do think that's a good reason. I think he deserves to be on the show, but I also think it's more likely that Death Battle will just wait until he gets a new, really popular front-running opponent. I don't know when that will be. Hopefully it happens sooner rather than later. Up next, Fused Zamasu versus Gore the God Butcher, Dragon Ball versus Marvel. I didn't see this matchup getting talked about all that much originally, but it certainly got a lot more popular after Goku Black versus Reverse Flash, and a little more after Thor Love and Thunder. Gore has had some other opponents being talked about, particularly from DC, but I don't see them trending as much anymore, definitely not as much as this one, and I'm not gonna lie, the animation could absolutely go off. Like, it's a Dragon Ball episode, it's a Cosmic Marvel episode, it could be so cool, but this is one of those episodes where I am arguably more excited for the analyses than the animation, because I honestly think the analyses could be even better. The biggest reason for this is a prime contrast matchup. It's literally one of the best contrast matchups I've ever seen. It is the way I think those kinds of matchups should be done, where the characters are still mostly the same, but with one huge difference. And in this case, this difference would make these characters naturally opposed to each other in the most satisfying way. To each of these characters, it is imperative that they kill the other, and I think that is amazing. It would enhance everything from the banter to the symmetry to the wrathfulness, and I don't even think I need to talk about how cool the script would be as far as analyzing the ideologies of these characters, because that's really the heart of this matchup. There is literally just one issue that I have with this idea, and yes, it is debate related, but it's in a different way, and in my opinion, in a worse way. Because it's not just that this matchup is one-sided, it's not just that it's horrendously one-sided and everyone knows it, it's the fact that Death Battle has already used so many of these kinds of characters before, even against each other, that we already know how Death Battle is going to analyze them basically down to the letter. We don't need Death Battle to tell us who they think wins this, because we already know the answer to that, and that makes the debate unnecessary and honestly pretty pointless. The only new aspect in this debate is the immortality aspect, and yeah, that is something, but given everything these characters can do, it's really not going to make a big enough impact. And honestly, this makes me so mad that such a cool concept like this suffers from this kind of problem. It's the main thing that's holding this matchup back from being among my most wanted episodes for Death Battle, but it's not something I can ignore because it does hinder a matchup's quality for me. The only thing worse than being a really one-sided debate is being a literally redundant one, and unfortunately I do think this is largely redundant, even if the analyses would be very different and would be so cool. I do still like it for what it does really well, to be clear, and I could definitely see it happening since it's still unique and uses big Death Battle moneymakers, but I wouldn't necessarily expect it. I think it might be technically a little past the prime time to have done it, but we know it was a pitched matchup, and I mean, that can only help its chances. Moving on, Chucky versus Slappy, Child's Play versus Goosebumps. I think this one needs no introduction. It is iconic in the general matchmaking space. I'm honestly a little surprised it wasn't in the Tournament of Champions Halloween week, because as far as the public consciousness goes, it's still one of the biggest horror ideas out there. Granted, I don't see it getting talked as much anymore in this community specifically, but I think it still deserves that relatively higher status. Me personally, I was always more drawn to this one than Chucky versus Springtrap. I don't know, maybe it's because they're both puppets, it just felt more appropriate to me in a lot of ways, I guess. Where I think this episode could really go above and beyond is the cinematography and how they frame everything, the color grading, the lighting, just how it looks. I think it's really easy to mix both of the tones together while still staying true to both of them, and honestly, this is one of those matchups where I really don't think you need pages and pages of connections, because at the end of the day, connections are there to explain why a matchup makes sense and why it should happen, etc. And I mean, come on, we know why these characters are fighting. You can just look at them and you know why the characters are fighting. This does not need to be explained to anyone. With that all being said though, I can understand there being some people who don't like this matchup that much because it's not perfect if you were to break it down category by category. There's less of a debate going on here than you might think at first glance, although it's nothing to the point where it's offensive or even anything that obvious in my opinion. And while I still hold to it that this matchup makes the most sense for both characters as far as a fight goes, it may still be a little tough to make that physical fight fun to watch, especially when it comes to the choreography. So while this matchup does have a lot of legacy behind it, and in a sense I think it deserves to happen on a show like Death Battle, I will admit that there are a lot of things that would need to be figured out, and I think it would need to rely a lot on its style, but it could still turn out really good. Personally, I can't see Slappy fighting anyone else on Death Battle, but I think this matchup happening completely hinges on what they want to do with Springtrap. If I were to wager a guess right now, I think Springtrap versus Junko feels slightly more likely, and of course this matchup does have more legacy behind it, but I don't know, maybe they'll put Springtrap against Bendy or someone else for all we know. All I know for sure is I do want to see Chucky versus Slappy, regardless of anything else. After that, Little Mac versus Makunouchi Ippo, Punch-Out versus Punch-Out versus Hajime no Ippo. This is, as specific as it is to say, the biggest anticipated next boxing death battle. Balrog versus TJ combo is still loved by many, myself included, and a lot of us want a present day version of that. They just want to see how Death Battle would do boxing again. And while I'm not quite as enthusiastic about this matchup specifically as I used to be, I would still be pretty damn excited for it. The best way I can describe an idea like this is that it is very simple, but with a lot of potential. The fight itself, of course, could be raw as hell and keep people on the edge of their seats, kind of like a real sporting event, but it also has the chance to show some really cool character studies in the analyses. Because I think a lot of people know these characters by name, but that's about it. They don't really know what they're like or what differentiates them from one another, and that especially goes for Little Mac if you ask me. So I think Death Battle should really prioritize talking about what drives them, what pushes them to become stronger and more skilled, because these are characters that I think could really benefit from getting that. The fight dynamic and choreography clearly speak for themselves. You could probably argue that this matchup isn't that debatable, but I find it to have a more acceptable level of debatability, at least if you're not including any Donkey Kong related stuff for Little Mac. I don't think Death Battle would, but I guess technically they could. And yeah, as long as they just make this one a better version of Balrog versus TJ combo with some different story and style elements here and there, then I would probably really love it. And there are some cool callbacks they can make as well, like if they want to refer back to the triangle theory of boxing, whether or not it actually makes a difference, I would really like to see that. It would be pretty nostalgic. And this part probably doesn't need to be said, but this still feels like the most likely option for both characters just based on the sheer matchup popularity. It was on the Tournament of Champions and the crew seems to be really into it. It would feel risky to try to do something different if you ask me. They would at least need Little Mac for sure though. If they're only going to have one of these characters, it's gonna be Little Mac because that's gonna get more clicks, but really I think it should be both of them. This is the matchup. And finally for this video, Great Demon King Piccolo versus Ryomen Sukuna, Dragon Ball versus Jujutsu Kaisen. Wow, we had a lot of anime this episode and more villains than we tend to get too. Simply put, Sukuna has tons and tons of matchups. I feel like Sukuna versus Muzan is kind of like the knee-jerk reaction for a lot of people, and I was kind of on the Sukuna versus Kishin Asura train before, although definitely not as much now. And he also has a lot of stinkers for matchups because you can't have so many and have all of them be created equal. However, I feel like King Piccolo is among Sukuna's most logical options, and honestly, I don't mind that. I think it would be cool to get a few more episodes that focus on more specific eras of Dragon Ball, like Cell versus Metal Sonic. The connections aren't stellar, I would say, but they are very representative of who they are as characters, and it would allow for a really cool episode personality, and I'd be really interested in seeing what the animation just looks like here. Not just because it involves JJK, which is already known for great and creative animation, but also because this is very much old gen versus new gen anime styles. This would be one of the most extreme examples of this that we will have seen on Death Battle, and I would just really like to see how they're able to manage that, how they mix all of that together in a cohesive crossover. In some ways, ways, this does kind of feel like your standard stats versus hacks or stats versus abilities debate, which I've kind of gone back and forth on, I'm not gonna lie, because while I still do hold to it that some stat gaps are just way too big for most abilities or hacks to be able to do anything about, I do think it is better if there are more talking points in debates, if there are more questions you have to answer, especially if either side can technically win. Is this the best example of that? Probably not, but it's still definitely a lot less boring than the worst examples, you know what I mean? Now, this may surprise some people, but I actually don't see this matchup being that likely to happen on the show. Some other stuff like Sukuna versus Muzan feels more likely to attract a non-versus crowd or a non-death battle community crowd, and even more importantly, I'm almost 100% sure that Death Battle would use King Piccolo significantly after regular Piccolo, if at all, and I'm also almost 100% sure they would want to use Sukuna long before then. So I just don't really think the timing is in this matchup's favor. Maybe it could happen sometime later as a Sukuna run back, but I'm not really going to be holding my breath for that. So guys, thank you all so much for watching, and as always, feel free to share your own feelings towards any of these fights. Remember to read the description to learn how matchups get selected for this series, and again, click the join button to participate in our ballot banters and guarantee your matchup gets talked about. Give this video a like if you liked it, subscribe if you want to see more, but no matter what you do, I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you when I see ya. Peace out.